Yes, and you can Google that, and you can still get this book. I've been buying them from Amazon for about 50 cents because they're older, but they're really quite important because it's the historical document where the Department of Labor and the Department of Education went into contract together, and they were creating these standards and proficiency skills in what they called personal qualities. And they were things like the interpersonal skills, honesty, integrity, getting along with others, responsibility, all of these things that are personality traits that cannot be measured in the United States because this is a violation of your freedom. Now, why am I concentrating so much on this whole area of attitudes and values? Because what I had found in the new reauthorization of ESA is that almost the entire sections in ESA are converting education to this mental health agenda. The entire system is moving toward that direction. And again, when I talk about mental health, what we're talking about is the social, emotional, and behavioral aspects of your children. And going back to the scans, what the Department of Labor said, there were two most important things that they were going to manage. One was functional literacy. And what was functional literacy? Just as it says, just enough literacy to function in society. And number two was the affective domain, the measuring, remediation, and interventions of attitudes, values, beliefs, and dispositions of your children. So this was the agenda. Now, when I said that I had testified against Hillary Care for the medicalization of schools, what we found at that time was that this agenda was moving forward to create what they called these mental health wraparound services, where the schools would apply for a partial hospitalization license. And in Pennsylvania, that's called a Provider 50 license. What that meant was the school could then bill for Medicaid. Now, when I say that a school can bill for Medicaid, many schools bill for Medicaid for special education children now. But what has happened is that the definitions have now changed. So no longer when you say that a child is handicapped and they're going to receive IDEA funds, this is your Individuals Disabilities with Education Act. This is the funding that was normally used for handicapped children. Well, what has happened is that the definition has changed for what is a disability. A disability can now mean something called related services. Something called related services would mean anything having to do with the social, emotional, and behavioral aspects of your children, which would include counseling, social services, psychiatry, psychology, etc. So with this criteria, when you go back to our ESA reauthorization, most of ESA is Title I. So when you also look at Title I, that was also, we were going to redefine what Title I was also, because before, Title I was to give funds to children who were poor. So no longer do you have to be poor to be at risk. So in these pieces of legislation coming forward in the reauthorization of ESA, you no longer have to be poor to be Title I, and you no longer have to be handicapped to receive IDEA funds, the Individuals, Disabilities, and Education Act. So these two criteria have been, we were referring to it as being bastardized, because basically what happened is they totally changed the whole criteria of what these funds were supposed to be targeting. So now Title I is for any child who is at risk for not meeting Common Core standards. And in IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, children would be targeted for mental health wraparound services, where a school can bill for Medicaid and create this billing in their schools. Now, when you think about this, if schools are going to apply for partial hospitalization licenses in order to create these services, okay, and in the legislation and in the new current legislation, which I have to tell you that just a couple days ago, Senator Alexander and Senator Murray, okay, Senator Alexander is from Tennessee and Senator Murray is from Washington State, and they came up with a compromise and an agreement because Alexander is a Republican and Murray is a Democrat, to bring forward a new authorization. So everything has changed from when we had read the legislation before. It is a 600-page bill, and I've only gone through half of it so far, and I've taken quite a few notes. But the notes that I have on the first 300 pages are really quite revealing. So they had announced that next Tuesday, and that is April the 14th, they are going to bring this bill to the floor for a vote. And that's just amazing. We have 1 week to get this information out across the country to tell the United States parents and citizens what this bill really says. Okay, the new bill is called Every Child Achieves Act of 2015. The statement of purpose is that all children will have a fair, equitable, and significant opportunity to achieve and to receive quality education. But throughout this whole entire bill, it continues to refer to Section 1114. And Section 1114, I believe, is on page 132. Part of it may be on 131. This is where a school is identified for interventions and supports. The whole agenda for interventions and support is a specialized instructional student support system, which is the social and emotional and behavioral aspects of your children. So when you read through this bill, it started talking about Section 1114 on page 12. And I would say every few pages they continue to talk about the interventions of your children, the specialized student support. It's on page 18. On page 24 of the new bill, it talks about specific benchmarks that would target goals and non-cognitive measures or indicators. That's your affective domain. That's your attitudes, values, opinions, and beliefs of your children. It also stated, and it also refers continually to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or also the Rehabilitation Act. That's 604 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is identifying a child for disabilities. It states on page 38 that they would produce individual student interpretive, descriptive, diagnostic reports. And it would be specifically on page 39 with children with disabilities to correspond to children who would need this support. On page 41, it continues to talk about IDEA and appropriate guidelines that they would have to have for IDEA. On page 58, very, very important, it says that funds would be there to support the multi-tiered system of support. That's your RTI, response to interventions, positive behavior interventions and supports, early intervening services. And I'll have to tell you this other little background information on Senator Murray. Senator Murray used to be a preschool teacher, and she said what was foremost of what she wanted to bring forward is universal pre-K. Now, of course, I think about 2 weeks ago I had written a paper on Senator Bob Casey, who is a senator in Pennsylvania. His father was Governor Bob Casey during the time of outcome-based education, and he had developed the Children's Cabinet that created this agenda of the mental health wraparound services and billing for Medicaid. Well, his son is doing the same thing, except he's doing it birth to kindergarten. And we have found that Casey's agenda is very much the same. If you read his criteria, it's beginning at birth and implementing the social, emotional, and behavioral aspects of your children. If you want to get the documentation for Casey's pre-K, you can just Google News with Views, Casey, Casey, and all of the documentation, the positive behavioral supports and the specialized support system and the RTI, response to intervention, is at the end of that paper. Casey had come out and he had said that Pennsylvania was a federal template for the universal pre-K. So all you have to do is look at all the documentation I have listed, and you can find all the functional behavioral assessments, everything that's going to be used to monitor, screen, diagnose your children in the mental health areas. Another thing that the bill was saying that on page 66 and also on page 75 is that all of this information that is being collected is going to be consistent with FERPA, Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And remember what I told you at the beginning. What President Obama had done was implement an executive order to allow this data to flow to third-party contractors. Now, that was through an executive order. So now
what were those 2 pages? 60.
The 2 pages on FERPA is 66 and 75 in the new bill, in the new Senator Alexander bill.
Anita, let me cut in just real quick. I want to introduce Jessica because, and I think that you make a very important point in saying that we've got 1 week to really get this information out. April 14th is really our go-to date.
Right.
We're on a time crunch. And so I want to introduce Jessica Anderson, who I have not had the chance to meet yet, but she comes highly, highly regarded from Wade Miller, who, if you're from Texas and